So given the speakers that we have today and the range of topics, I would like to go straight into it. I have my little clock here to help keep time. But so the first question I would like to ask to all of the speakers in turn, and you, I think, know the order, is if you could each say a few words about your involvement with infrastructure and its role in what you study. So I'd like to start with Jeff, then go to Jennifer, Paul, and Noortje. So Jeff, maybe you could kick us off.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation to this fabulous workshop, and I'm looking forward so much to the discussion. And my own background in infrastructure sort of goes back to knowledge infrastructure for the longest time. And I've been interested in sort of what, lately talking about the Enlightenment project and Enlightenment learning, and seeing that as basically a highly colonial project, which foreshadowed the kind of data collection, data control that we have going today. So it's a very long history of forms of knowledge and forms of colonialism. So I've been interested for a number of years in trying to think about new kinds of knowledge infrastructure that we can put into place, which would be appropriate to the political and social problems that we have today. The second generic line of interest, I think the best example of this lately is Kate Crawford's wonderful new book, The Atlas of AI. And it's a reminder that nothing vanishes into the air. the cloud is highly material. Lithium is mined in places where it's in extremely extractive manners, both with respect to the earth and with respect to local indigenous cultures. And so recognizing that every infrastructure, every knowledge infrastructure, every information infrastructure is very much a physical infrastructure, which is having a huge impact on our planet. So those would be the two main angles.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, I wondered if you could chime in. It feels like a good link.
And just to second my thanks to Ursula, Jonathan, and everyone. But yes, that is an interesting reference, since my own work has been really for probably 25 years now engaged with infrastructure, and this was the topic of my PhD, which is the materiality of digital media, and looking especially at electronic waste. So all the ways that electronics fall apart and the infrastructure is required to make, sustain, and dispose of electronics. It's interesting now to see the kind of return to the materiality of the digital, but this is exactly the problem that I was looking at in a book I published called Digital Rubbish, Natural History of Electronics, which was thinking about the materiality of the digital as a kind of challenge to the ways that dematerialization had been configured, and the kind of politics of why things were being dematerialized in the way that they were, to allow for greater consumption, to hide labor practices that might be unjust, to draw attention away from the flows of waste that were often moving from the global north to the global south, and so on. So materiality of infrastructure here was not just about pointing to something physical and saying that it was kind of laptop or a desktop, but also pointing to the way that these material processes were creating infrastructure. So that was kind of I guess really an investigation that was going in two directions for me. One was drawing on my prior work in landscape architecture, where it was, I suppose you could say, making infrastructures of the conventional sense. But I brought this to my interest in digital media and really thinking about communications of all sorts as being sort of environmental infrastructures. But they're also infrastructures of settler colonialism, as we've heard already. So thinking about infrastructures as devices of accumulation and displacement. And I think Ursula's introduction really helpfully set us up in thinking about how we might create more just infrastructures. And this is very much the focus of my work now, which is looking at smart forests, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But it's really thinking about the new planetary infrastructures that are being developed to potentially offset carbon, preserve forest spaces, and how these are giving rise to different kinds of green infrastructure, or nature's infrastructure, which is a term that has circulated across landscape architecture and STS. So this is a way, I guess, of thinking about infrastructure not as an artifact, but as a process and a practice.
Thank you so much. Paul, this feels like it leads on quite nicely to some of your work.
Oh boy, there's so much to say about this. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited about today. Well, let me just do it in terms of my own intellectual history. When I was working on my dissertation which became my first book in the 1980s, what I was looking at was the construction of a global command and control system for the U.S. military using computers, and that was a new thing during the Cold War that became enormous and comprehensive, and then involved all kinds of different instruments in space, in the air, underwater, and so on. And I wasn't calling it infrastructure then, but that was what I was looking at. And part of the conclusion I came to was the fact that those systems were built played a major role in how the American military understood what it was doing and what it could do. You can articulate strategy, but unless you can actually make that strategy real in the material world, it doesn't make any difference. So this was also the period when large technical systems became a big theme in the history of technology. So Tom Hughes and his work on electrical power grids, and then many others who studied things like air traffic control systems. And maybe the place to end for now about this is that in the later part of the 1990s, there was this thing called the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection, run by the Clinton administration. And for reasons I no longer remember, I got involved in that and saw a number of hearings that commission conducted across the country as they kind of toured. And what they were looking at was the relationships across infrastructural systems, so telephone, internet, power grid, other major systems that we live with, and how those things could be attacked, not so much by attacking one system as by attacking the connections. So, if you take down the power grid, you can also take down the telephone system and the internet. If you take down the internet today, you can take down the power grid. And there are, ways of attacking the power grid through the internet and so on. So the collection of infrastructures that we developed and live with became so interconnected that they were also very vulnerable for that same reason. And we're seeing the vulnerability really in a lot of ways today around climate change, because all those interconnections mean that everything is connected to fossil fuel power. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Noortje.
Yeah, thank you to Ursula and colleagues for the invitation today. So I came to infrastructures, I guess, via a rather roundabout way, via issue networks. So in the early 2000s, I was working with colleagues with digital methods to study issue publics. So we were mapping online networks that were thematizing, topicalizing complex issues like climate change on the web. And what I found especially interesting about issue networks was the way in which they implicated actors both antagonistically and materially, especially as a lot of the issues we were looking at, issues like climate change, at the time were referred to as abstract issues. Globalizing issue formations considered abstract. Well, so what I then became interested in was looking for empirical strategies to locate these effusive formations called the issue public, so that I could, make some sort of get some movement on how we can study this dual mode of issue engagement, of being both materially and antagonistically implicated in an issue like climate change, which have such polarizing effects, I think, across social and public life. So I went looking for very concrete research sites, and like eco homes and local renewable energy communities, and conducting fieldwork in these kind of sites. I encountered these sort of political material entanglements, but of a type that weren't quite issue networks, that were far more extensive, that included things like emerging standards for environmental building performance, constraints on which kinds of energy was transportable. So I think these kind of arrangements, they're sort of both extensiveness, but also the way in which material social infrastructures constrain action as much as inform capacities for political action, which is what the notion of issue public really foregrounds. That's how I sort of came to really appreciate infrastructure as an infrastructuring, to refer to Jeff Bowker's work as a guiding concern.
Thank you so much. So we have a bit of a sense across all of your work about how you arrived to infrastructure, but I thought it would be also good to step back and situate a little bit more this notion of infrastructure, where it comes from, how its meaning has changed. As Lee and Jeff put it, I think in several places in their work, thinking about when is an infrastructure, and also in relation to concerns that have been raised by all of you, infrastructure as a kind of key part of what one might consider the sort of an anthropology of modernity. It has sort of very specific sorts of ways of performing and shaping relations. But to start with, I thought, Paul, you did this wonderful tweet providing a kind of a threaded history of infrastructure. I wondered whether you might be able to, taking that as a starting point, unpack a little bit this sort of brief history of infrastructure as you see it.
Sure. Well, I'll put the link to the tweet in the chat, or actually, Jonathan, maybe you can do it. So I would like to say something that's not in that tweet, which is that the real ancestor of infrastructure studies is Karl Marx, and his ideas about base and superstructure, and the famous claim that the hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, and the steam mill gives you society with the industrial capitalist. It's very important, sort of socially shaping character of technological systems, especially large ones. To me, that's become a major theme of technology studies in general. But the word infrastructure goes back into the 18th century, but really gains its first major foothold in the 1950s and 60s with military systems. There was a NATO conference on infrastructure in the 1960s where they began to talk about that kind of thing. There's the large technological systems thread of science and technology studies, Tom Hughes, Viva Baker, Trevor Pinch, and so on. And then, of course, my own most important inspiration came from Jeff Bowker and Lee Starr and their studies of infrastructure, especially information infrastructures. Another piece of that was, there's a beautiful unfinished and never published book manuscript by Ola Hanseth and Eric Montero that was called Understanding Infrastructure, that was also a big inspiration for me. Finally, there's the Tensions of Europe network that developed in the early 2000s, and has done a huge amount of work on the notion of infrastructure as a relationship among nations, how European borders were created and crossed and then interrupted by the construction and then the deconstruction of things like railroad networks and communication networks and so on. And then maybe the last thing to mention is that those interruptions are as important as the constructions. So when we begin to, recently I've been thinking a lot about how knowledge infrastructures can be destroyed as well as created, and there are increasingly very strategic moves to make that happen. It's been going on in climate change forever, but now it's we see it happening with respect to institutions like the Centers for Disease Control. So let me stop with that.
Great. Jeff, I also, picking up on what Paul said, wondered whether you could elaborate a bit on drawing on what you were saying earlier, this kind of relational conception of infrastructure that emerges in your work with Lee, and how you arrived at that, and also whether there was a sense of thinking potentially along with, but also potentially against or in relation to other notions of information infrastructure, which were in the air in the 1990s, and whether there was also a playfulness in repurposing, reclaiming, or appropriating this notion.
Let me respond to that somewhat sideways. I want to pick up on a point that that Paul made, which I totally resonate with, which is, it's odd how little Marx is brought into play when we talk about the history of infrastructure as a concept. And the whole idea of determination in the last instance by the economy, by the means of production. I mean, I think that's the kind of causality that many of us have been playing with for a long time. And also I see, it's probably slightly tenuous, but I also see a relationship with knowledge infrastructure in Alfred Zone Rattel's fantastic paper, Science as Alienated Consciousness, which talks about the relationship between the commodity form as discussed in Marx and the idea of Galilean universal time and space. So I think, in many ways, kind of Marxist studies, either from Marx or from Zone Rattel, really push this forward. On the relational side, okay, relational and repurposing. Let's do relational first. Yeah, I think this is much more Lee's point than mine, and I'm dearly sorry that she can't be here today for the discussion. But yes, her point was always one person's infrastructure is, sorry, one person's thing is another person's infrastructure. Infrastructures don't exist outside of a context of use, outside of a context of development. So things for me which are fully infrastructural, like the wiring in the wall or something like that. Yeah, I mean that's fun. That's really, I don't need to think about it when I flip a switch. But if I'm an electrician, that's an object. I mean, it's not so much, an infrastructure is something that they grapple with, that they're dealing with front and center every day. So we always have things which slip into the background, and we always have things which are foregrounded for us. I think one of the interesting concepts here is one that actually Corey Knobel came up with several years ago, which is that of occlusion. That every time you cast light on something, you're occluding something else. And that for me is core for infrastructure. What gets occluded, what gets buried in the very act of creating something which is transparent and so easy to use. For relationship to, I mean, that's a great question about the playful infrastructures and reimagining infrastructure. I'm not quite certain what you're referring to in the 90s there, Jonathan. So, I might ask you to develop more in a minute. But yeah, I think that's very much the task that we're faced with today. I think Paul's made this wonderful comment, that was at the end of the day, it's all about infrastructure. Politics is all about infrastructure. And reimagining, repurposing infrastructure is not just a case of, in in the old critical discourse of using the tools of the master. We cannot just use the tools of the master. We cannot develop infrastructure in the way, we can't just turn a switch and turn an unjust infrastructure into a just one. We need to really deeply rethink how we infrastructure and what we mean by infrastructuring in order to create radically new forms of life and radically new forms of knowledge.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, I wondered whether this might be a good moment to talk about your talking of repurposing and extending concepts, digital infrastructures of witness, which also relates to this notion of a kind of relational rereading of infrastructure, which maybe we can come back to expand upon a little more. But I guess just to kind of respond to Jeff's comment, I was really thinking of in the 1990s, information infrastructures, information superhighways, which are of course a way of embedding within infrastructure, very particular, in a way, social and political ontology about what there is and how relationships are embedded and, in information services, but also relationships in the states and the marketing systems. But in Jennifer's work, you have a really interesting take on repurposing and rethinking environmental sensing practices and infrastructures, which perhaps you could introduce here.
Yes, thanks for that, Jonathan. And I think, many of the points I'll make here will probably resonate with what's already been said about relational infrastructures by Jeff. But digital infrastructures of witness is a concept I developed in the last chapter of Program Earth. And here I'm thinking about how digital technologies are organizing experience, and they're organizing relationships through certain temporalities, through ways of coordinating, often optimizing. So it's not just a kind of being together, but it's often toward particular kinds of objectives that align with computational logics. So these are within a smart city context, which is how I unpack this, ways of organizing the coordination of people and buildings and energy systems to often be more efficient and in this logic sort of sustainable. So this is a way of thinking about the relationality of infrastructure as being organized in particularly kind of computational ways, and asking then what that means for collective life, what that means for how humans and more than humans come together to experience, expand on environments, and how this might also structure different kinds of exclusions and inclusions, inequalities, and so on. So I think a lot of this also is informed by, I liked how people are sort of mentioning some of their favorite infrastructural readings. So one of my longstanding favorite pieces is Abdu Malik Simone's People as Infrastructure. And a lot of my thinking here is informed by these ways of thinking about infrastructure as something that people are doing often also in the absence of certain kinds of infrastructure that might be taken for granted. So I think that's quite interesting, the idea that infrastructure is in the background. And then these other kind of pluralistic ways of thinking about infrastructure as something that's maybe more in a liminal zone. It's neither background or foreground, but it's something that's continually sort of being made through negotiations. And it becomes perhaps a kind of that other register of infrastructure, which is public works. It becomes something that has to be worked at and on. It's kind of contingent. And it can also sort of fade away or be undone if the people or the entities aren't there to make the infrastructure in that way. So I would say lingering in the background of this idea of digital infrastructures of witness is, of course, radical empiricism and process philosophy, but it's also Simone's idea of people as infrastructure, which I think probably resonates with some of the things that other people have said in terms of structuring material actions and possibilities for collective life, with that being a kind of iterative relation as well.
Hey, and that's perfect. I love the way that this is all working out. I tried my best to script things, but it's unfolding very organically here, which is Noortje. And I know that you have written about this and commented in various places about the significance of this what John Durham Peters calls infrastructural turn in relation to your own work on issue publics, material participation, and testing societies, and the kinds of material conditions under which publics form in the current moment, alongside, with, through, and around infrastructure. So I wonder if you could maybe say anything about this.
Yeah. I first I would like to add some names to that list that started with Karl Marx, because I think it's also really important to look at phenomenology. So you can think of Heidegger, but also very much Alfred Schutz, and critical approaches in phenomenology like Dorothy Smith, who each in different ways emphasize the taken for grantedness of the scientific and technological systems that form the background conditions of everyday life in technological societies. And here I think infrastructure is really important as a sign, or perhaps even a kind of an index of the chronic forgetfulness of societies marked by science and technology, of its backgrounds conditions. So infrastructure is then really what defines techno-scientific societies, but forgetfulness of those background conditions also really defines science and technological societies. And the second influence, which has already been mentioned, but I've also find more and more important, is work in anthropology. So quite empirically driven work, often of field work across global south, but also the north and the global north, highlighting infrastructuring. So the ongoing, mundane, improvised accomplishments of the social material arrangements that make possible everyday life. And I think Jennifer has also done really, I think, sort of insightful and foresightful work in this regard on, for instance, environmental monitoring. And what I find really interesting there is also the changing status and possible changing significance of infrastructure, especially as regards that connection between taken for granted and background condition of everyday life. Because it does seem, when we look across contemporary areas, whether it's infrastructure of health testing with COVID, or testing of automated systems in mobility infrastructures, that we see infrastructure becoming quite problematic in many situations, to the point that I'm wondering how that connection between infrastructure and taken for granted may really be changing today. I mean, on a general level, what I'm pointing towards is that these dynamics of the becoming problematic of infrastructure, the undoing of the taken for granted of infrastructure, that kind of political dynamic may not be, pulling in the opposite direction from the process of infrastructuring. And the fact that I'm preoccupied with that, I mean, it might also have to do, to mention a last influence, with actor network theory, where there was a lot of emphasis on stabilization of infrastructure as the sort of almost inevitable direction that processes of infrastructuring would take. And I think in the practices of political mobilization and contestation of infrastructure that we see today, and I mentioned a few areas just now, that to infrastructure and to make public may not be pulling in opposite directions today.
Hey, again, a perfect segue into what I was going to ask about next, which is precisely this moment of contesting infrastructure, this notion that we cannot take infrastructure for granted anymore for all sorts of reasons, whether, Mark Zuckerberg characterizing Facebook as a social infrastructure, and the kind of construal of what Anna Helmond, and she'll talk about this in the next session, I imagine, describes as a sort of platform. And also there's been some wonderful work by Paul and JC Plantan and many others on the relationship between infrastructures and platforms. So we can't take for granted the description of things which have particular sorts of commercial logics as infrastructures, but there's also breakdowns of infrastructure. And of course, we saw how different workers were kind of characterized as critical or not during the pandemic. We have blue infrastructures of waterways, green infrastructures of ecologies, of plants, trees, fungi, and other things. And even recently, discussions of faces as being infrastructures. And against this background of problematizing infrastructures, infrastructural issues, and sort of politics of contesting infrastructures, maybe I could ask you, each of you, to say a little bit more about the broader stakes of infrastructure research in the current situation in relation to issues and challenges that we face. So I know there's a lot, but Jennifer, would you mind?
Yes, I'll try to at least deal with a bit of that, but picking up maybe on what Noortje was suggesting about climate change and infrastructure and how this really challenges perhaps the kind of settled status of infrastructure. I think this is a really important point, and also thinking about how infrastructure is not a kind of human accomplishment only, also that it really depends upon environments and more than human entities and all sorts of conditions that allow infrastructure to settle into the background. But that also we might take a note from Winona LaDuke and Deborah Cohen in their study on Windigo infrastructure to really think about what infrastructure is this that has been allowed to settle into the background, and how might infrastructure be done otherwise. So they very much take issue with the extractive infrastructures that have settled into form as the dominant infrastructures, the fact that these are environmentally destructive, that they lead to forms of dispossession and inequality and environmental injustice. But rather than resist the category of infrastructure, they really ask how it might be transformed and done otherwise. And they have a whole host of really interesting examples for how people are doing exactly that. But I think this is a difficult and contested area, and this is really what's at stake. And of course, inevitably, I suppose somebody had to mention Biden's infrastructure bill. And in the early days, there were all kinds of different infrastructural packages, projects packed into that. And there was this kind of, one could almost say, a sort of straw person debate about the hard and the soft infrastructure, and really arguing that infrastructure was hard infrastructure by people of sort of perhaps more conservative sway, and that the soft infrastructure wasn't really infrastructure. But I think this is what LaDuke and Cohen's article really raises, is why has infrastructure come to be seen in this way as a kind of Windigo infrastructure? How might it be done otherwise so that it's more just and equitable, and also responsive to environmental conditions, so that these settlements of infrastructure can't be taken for granted. Maybe they shouldn't be allowed to settle into the background, especially now when there's so much at stake for how infrastructure should be transformed for planetary survival.
Thank you. So I'm trying to, ill-advisedly trying to type notes as you're talking, but Paul, maybe you could come in on this point as well.
Sure. Wow. I'd like to talk for half an hour about this. So one of Jonathan's provocations here in the notes that we have is, Mark Zuckerberg is characterizing Facebook as a social infrastructure. And part of what that says to us is that the claim that something is infrastructure has become a powerful claim. And we see that in the bill that Jennifer was just talking about, and how that was approached, and the desire to, on the part of some parties, to exclude the human elements of all infrastructures as being, legitimate parts of those systems. And, I would say that things like public schools are maybe, are some of the most important infrastructures of all. I also want to throw out a provocation of my own, which is I think the word infrastructure is so widely used now that it's almost becoming meaningless. And it's important to try to distinguish between what is a true infrastructure and what is merely a system, by which I mean something that is centrally designed and controlled by one entity like Facebook. And Facebook's claim to infrastructure is interesting because it relies on drawing in all the media around it that people post, so it becomes like a publisher, a republisher of things. So it's an interesting claim, and at the same time, you can see why it's the fact that it's a system, in the fact that Facebook continually tries to make it hard for people to leave that environment with anything that is posted on Facebook. So it wants to take over email with Messenger. It won't let you copy things directly into Twitter, and so on. So, systems try to maintain their boundaries and keep control. Infrastructures behave more like ecologies and networks where many things can be drawn in. And something like Facebook does have an infrastructural quality, as we've argued in the Down paper that somebody mentioned a few minutes ago. But really, the more important things socially are things like, railroads. And here, let me just point out that the arguments over American constitutional law in the end of the 19th century were about the railroads, and the power of the federal government in the United States comes entirely out of the litigation around how to interpret the Commerce Clause with respect to interstate commerce led by the railroads. So we have these moments where major infrastructures become hugely shaping of the societies they're in, and not necessarily just by building stuff, but also by altering legal systems and even constitutional systems. So the last thing I want to say about this, which is becoming an important kind of line for me, is that infrastructure is the real policy. This goes back to Larry Lessig and his argument that code is law surrounding the internet. And I think we can say the same thing about something like the fossil fuel infrastructure that we have. Part of the reason it's so hard to change that is that it controls policy because we need it and depend on it. So I'll stop there.
Noortje, I wondered whether you could follow up on this point.
Yeah. To add a term that maybe we haven't mentioned so much yet, which is that of infrastructuralization. So there are a number of papers have appeared, many drawing on Paul's work, that foreground this idea that the internet is being infrastructuralized in society, in contemporary societies. And I think this is very important in that it is a point where internet studies connects with debates about wider societal debates about austerity and privatization. So where we see that that internet-based systems are rendered or are emerging as systems that are critical to the functioning of society, we can see very clearly the connection with, shrinking of public investment, withdrawal of the state from certain responsibilities, as in the welfare state. So I think that is a very critical or crucial concept. But also because it maybe allows us to connect across so the studies of infrastructure and studies of society, in that, when we look how internet-based systems become critical to the function of society, we see that these systems are at the same time also really critically dependent on participation. So, and I don't mean that just in the sort of classic notion of enrollments, so that technological systems need users in order to, be successful as technological systems. I also mean it in the sense that participatory culture is really at the core of many internet-based services. They are optimized for participations, not necessarily for the interests of participants. So I think that's really something where I would say, if we're interested in contestation, that's sort of the space which requires attention. Because of course, when we look at these infrastructuralized sort of internet-based societal systems, they're not optimized for society. They're optimized for quite different interests. And here the Marx reference is probably an important one. So to just sum up, the sort of decreasing capacity of the state to ensure society's welfare, and also the shift from universal coverage-based ideals connected with a welfare society to systems much more focused on the micro-targeting of limited segments of the population. Like all those shifts, infrastructure is really at the center of it. But we need to, I think, really zoom in on those connections to get to why infrastructure is becoming so important today.
I love also in following infrastructure closely, you see also changes in the state from perhaps a welfarist notion to a regulatory state, and the infrastructure as a way of organizing market relations. But Jeff, did you want to comment on this point on contesting infrastructure?
I mean, there are so many connections I want to make right now, so I'll try and do them a little bit briefly. So jumping back a little bit, Noortje, on when you were mentioning forgetting before, reminds me of Mary Douglas's wonderful stuff around the institution of psychology always forgets that memory is social. It rediscovers it about once a generation, but it's infrastructurally set up to forget. And I think there's something really interesting in that insight of hers. What's at stake? I mean, the massive hypocrisy in the last few days. Biden comes back from COP26, and then the next day or the next week, he's doing record leases for oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, it's that's sort of what's at stake here. I mean, this is really, really significant. It's really significant, and we are addicted, as Paul said. We are addicted to this infrastructure, and it's very, very difficult to get beyond it. But it's certainly, Biden is showing no leadership. For all his sweet talk of infrastructure. I guess 2 points I want to finish on here, though, about the stakes, which are, one is, well, related to this. Timothy Mitchell's really great in Carbon Democracy about the fact that we're burning up, 400 years of plant production every year on the face of the earth until we run out. And that our societies and our infrastructures were largely built. The idea of constant growth, the idea of kind of Keynesian economics is predicated on precisely this extractive technology. So you cannot say the extraction is different. We can sit above it and criticize it. We are part of the extractive process, and we need to recognize that ourselves. But I also want to finish maybe by, I can make the connection, it may not be totally obvious, but it was great for me when Noortje also brought up phenomenology and the role of phenomenology here. Kate Hales has been great on this. What infrastructures are getting very, very good at right now is controlling periods of time that we have no access to. They work at timescales we just can't imagine. They make decisions that we have no relationship with, before we even had half a thought, it's a missing half second or whatever it is that Kate talks about. And I think this colonization, if we say the 19th century was the colonization of space through infrastructures like railroads, steamships, or whatever, the 21st century is the colonization of time. And it's a colonization of time through the putting into place of things like meta, which we absolutely need to recognize that this temporal colonization is as swinging, as important to fight as was the spatial.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to all of you. And this is, I guess, I think looking at the time, this is maybe our last round that we can do, unfortunately, because I'm really enjoying this discussion. It's so generative. But when it comes to looking not only at contestation around infrastructure and the problematization of infrastructure, which, as Noortje alluded to, may also bring about new gatherings of publics, new sorts of issues, new formations, which show infrastructures not to be characterized by the stability, but also by them no longer being able to be taken for granted. Coming back to the beginning of the discussion, how you all arrived at the notion of infrastructures, I wonder if we could close with a round on what each of the panelists think that research on infrastructures might contribute to potentially rethinking, recomposing, reclaiming, or contributing to more equitable, more responsible, more careful forms of infrastructuring, whether informed by, and I think I'm mentioning some of the things that have been brought up already, whether it's feminist approaches, ecological approaches, decolonial approaches. I know there's a fantastic series at the moment on just infrastructures happening in the US, and I think there's a lot of kind of work in this area at the moment. But I wondered whether you might be able to say a little bit more about what role researchers might play, and research in this area might play in contributing to that quite urgent process of recomposing infrastructures. And maybe we could go from Noortje to Paul to Geoff to Jennifer. So Noortje first.
Yeah, in the interest of time, let me just focus on 2 points. So one is to return to this backgrounding of infrastructure, because it is a thing, you know, this backgrounding of infrastructure is really very forceful, powerful effect, I think, in our society and culture. So the imagination of a public as an infrastructuring formation is still really minoritarian. Like I am really quite tempted to understand things like populist movements partly in these terms, so that, you know, the overdetermination of concepts like sovereignty or freedom of speech, that it really has something to do with the sort of the void that has been created by this inability to imagine a public as a complex infrastructural distributed formation. So this is also why I think that this conceptual theory work on, so what is this infrastructuring public, continues to be really crucial. But also, of course, this kind of front staging or foregrounding of these backgrounds as what empirical research is really very much, I think, should continue to be about. Just to also make clear that this notion of, you know, infrastructure becoming problematic doesn't mean that now infrastructure is social, it is public or publicizing, it isn't. And the other point is across scale. So I think several people here, and I also see Alison Powell here, who's doing great work on quite local, sustainable community controversies. That you know, a lot of these type of practices, they are considered, you know, quite little. So when you also look at the kind of places where infrastructuring meets publics, and in my own research, it is street trials of autonomous vehicles. Now, these tend to be considered as sort of little end of the pipe moments where, you know, maybe they have demonstrational value. These are experiments that serve as publicity for big infrastructure companies, but really the real work happens elsewhere. And I think this is where it's really for social cultural researchers really important to push back against that sort of scalar diminution. of social and political cultural practices of infrastructuring. So to really stress that these are cross-scalar interventions, just as infrastructures are cross-scalar tricks. Expensive, big, important tricks, but also tricks.
Thank you so much, Noortje. Here I can't help but think of the work of Anna Tsing, who has made this point beautifully also in the work on friction. But Paul.
Yeah, well, here too, we could go on and on. I could talk all day about this. So I think I'll just make 2 points. One is that the core of science and technology studies, in a lot of ways, is the notion that all systems are socio-technical. And I think just hammering on that has enormous importance because, as we were talking about in the infrastructure debate, there's a contingent that would like it to just be, big capital intensive projects with roads and bridges and wires and cables. And yet even those systems are full of people maintaining them, designing them, thinking about their futures and selling them. So part of where that goes is also toward the fact that, I wrote an article in a book that Jeff and I were both involved in on individual habits and group norms and routines as actually elements of infrastructure. So part of the resistance to infrastructural change comes from us. We are infrastructured by the things that we live in. And since habits are much easier to, maintain than conscious, deliberate reactions, once that's happened to us, we become resistant to infrastructural change. And these systems rely on that feature. So if you think about the relationship between infrastructure and climate change, fossil fuel infrastructure and climate change, that's a lot of what's going on. People don't want to have to think out their practices with relationship to those systems. They just use them and rely on them. It's also why the interests that uphold those infrastructures want us to focus on individual deliberate action, because they know that that doesn't work very well, and that really infrastructural change is what makes the ultimate policy change.
Thank you so much. Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be struggling to make half a point here, I think. And first of all, I want to go back to an invitation Jonathan gave a little bit earlier, which I didn't respond to, the question of when is infrastructure, which for me goes back to the classic article by Ulrike Angerstrom, When is a Tool? And I think, this partly in response to Paul's earlier comments as well. It's infrastructure when it's useful and interesting to think about it as infrastructure. When it enables you to take stuff from over here, from this field of human knowledge, this field of endeavor, and pull it somewhere else where you weren't expecting it, and get insights which actually travel between one and the other. If you want a string theory reference, it's like, the equivalence between the different classes of solutions in string theory enables simple problems in one domain to become complex in another, and complex in one domain to become single in the first. But I wanted to, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I sort of wanted to end a little bit with, Suzanne Simard's great stuff about trees and forest networks and mycelial networks, something Anna Tsing also wrote really beautifully about. And the Centre for Unconventional Computing in England has been playing with the idea of a mycelial computer as an environmental computer. And that then got me to think about this kind of awful prospect of, we get the Internet of Things meeting the mycelial computer. So we get a total fusion of nature society. And I think it's that understanding, dealing with infrastructure is dealing with the real world. It is dealing with the natural world. And we need to take that fully on board as we analyze nature and as we analyze society.
Thank you so much. And that leads perfectly back to Jennifer to close.
Yeah, so I might just very quickly circle back then to where I started at the beginning, which is thinking about this question of intervention into infrastructure from the perspective of practice, which is how I first came to infrastructure so long ago. And this might resonate also with Noortje's point about experimentation, but in some work that I've done through the Citizen Sense project, we've looked at how citizens are attempting to make infrastructure otherwise, whether it's through monitoring their air to document where traffic pollution is occurring, proposing garden spaces to absorb pollution, remaking roadways, creating more walkable and livable environments, and a whole host of other interventions. People are doing these things now, and it's actually quite sort of spreading like wildfire, I would say, in many places. And it leads inevitably, I suppose, to different kinds of negotiations taking place over what is infrastructure, what are the habits that people want to live with. Many people are refusing the kind of habits that have become customary in terms of driving and breathing polluted air and living in environments without proper green space and all the rest of it. So in our work with monitoring air pollution with communities, we find that people are not just documenting what's in the air, they're often making proposals about how to act on that data and to remake and transform the infrastructures that they're living with. So I think this is where I'm seeing interventions already take place, interventions that social researchers could not only study but contribute to in different ways. This is something we've attempted to do through practice-based research in the Citizen Sense project. And I would think that there's much more work that could be done here to actively transform infrastructures and ways of life. So hopefully that kind of answers the question about infrastructural interventions. I think with that, inevitably there'll probably be a rethinking of what is infrastructure along the lines that we've sort of discussed today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you so much, Paul, Jeff, Noortje, all of you for joining us today. It's been a fantastic discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope there may be ways to continue discussion after today. But thank you so much. If we were together, we would all have a big round of applause. But that brings us to the end of the panel.